Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm Ciara. I'm here as a bereaved wife. My husband Eddie was killed in 2018. I'm also here as a Road Peace member, the charity I went to when I needed support after Eddie was killed. And also I think it's relevant for this conversation to tell you that I'm a journalist, because that has informed how I now use my story, and how you can use people like me and our stories to help the work that you're doing, which obviously is incredibly important. So this is Eddie, my husband. He was really good looking, as you can see. And that's our son, Seren. Seren was 2 when Eddie was killed. He was a cyclist, a really skilled cyclist actually, but he was killed when he was on his motorbike, which I often feel like I have to caveat by saying, I mean, he was like a really good motorbike rider. He was, because often I think there's this kind of assumption when you say, oh, it was a motorbike, and people go, oh God, death traps. But actually, because he was such a safe motorbike rider, he was killed that day because he didn't filter through traffic. He approached a queue of traffic on the M4. 3 lanes of traffic had actually slowed to a standstill, and rather than filter up the edge, he slowed to the back and he waited, and he was hit at around 50-60 miles per hour by a van. The van driver initially said, I didn't see him. I just didn't see him. Also tried to imply, oh, I think he'd been weaving, so, I just hadn't seen him. But we were very fortunate early on to know that there were really strong eyewitness testimonies that had not only seen how well Eddie was riding that day, but also that he was completely stationary behind the traffic. I think I'll just quickly tell you a bit about Eddie's death before I move on to the investigation and how that impacted things. You'll hear from many victims of road violence that a death like this is horrific, because you go from being so completely full of life, young, starting a family, we were living a really perfect, happy life, to that moment of everything is completely blown up. And it's interesting because the eyewitness testimony, a lot of people said it was like a bomb had gone off, like the noise, the impact, the debris, it was like a bomb had gone off. And my life felt like it was in that bomb, and did for quite a long time afterwards. I just got to my desk at the Reuters newsroom, had sat down and was discussing my first story with my editor, and I had a phone call from a mobile number, which I wouldn't normally have answered, and fate happens in certain ways, and I did answer it, and I just remember a police officer saying, your husband's being resuscitated at the roadside, he's really poorly, he's really poorly, and you need to get to the hospital right now. And I remember thinking, God, that's a really weird choice of words, poorly, because I think, well, that's when you got the flu, you're poorly, and this is a guy who runs marathons and is really fit, and he's a vegan and he doesn't drink. And then, there's sort of fragments of memory of getting to the hospital, and being informed really quite early on that he wasn't going to survive, that you can't be hit with such force and survive ever. Even though he was clinically alive, his brain was dead, because it can't shake that many times in its skull and not bleed to bits. So I saw him probably a few hours after that, and he didn't look like Eddie. He didn't look like he'd been cut or bruised or anything like that. In fact, his body was completely fine because he wore loads of protective clothing when he was on the bike. But he looked like a brain-damaged person. He looked completely and utterly harrowing. It's an image that, has faded a bit in time, but will never completely go. So that's just a real kind of snippet into the immediate horror, and you've probably all heard lots of stories like that. But then obviously you have an additional traumatic process that comes after that when you have an investigation. And if there were such a thing as a best case scenario for an investigation into a death like this, I think I got it. I immediately had a very, very supportive police team, and it's something I really like to advocate now, to try and help either other families that are going through the process or to help police officers that are maybe going into particularly family liaison roles, that kind of thing. And I was really fortunate that we had evidence really, really early on. So there was eyewitness testimony that was really solid. And then a couple of weeks into the investigation, there was a Harrods van that came forward and said, I've got 360 footage, not just dashcam footage, I've got a whole 360 for miles. It had clocked Eddie riding for miles really safely. And then the police were able to form their investigation using that, which meant that the driver had to completely change his course that he was on. He was on a course of, I'm going to deny this, I'm going to hope they don't have any evidence, and I am going to plead not guilty, and I'm going to take this family through this harrowing process of having to face a trial. And thankfully, they were able to show him this footage when they took him in the second time for questioning, at which point he knew there was no getting away from what he'd done. And he then said to the police, and I want you to tell the family that I intend to plead guilty. What we did manage to establish was that he was so distracted from the road that his eyes were not on the road for up to 16 seconds, which is, I remember hearing that the first time and thinking, oh, okay, maybe he must have looked at his phone or something briefly. And then I was like, no, hang on, 16 seconds. And very early on, I'm kind of ashamed to admit it, but I got in a car and I thought I'm going to try it because I'm not that fussed about living at the moment. So I'm going to try it. And I closed my eyes for, I would say, less than a second, because you actually can't imagine taking your eyes away from the road for that long. It's kind of nuts. Like, you can actually do loads of stuff in 16 seconds. I'm a single mum. I know how to do loads of stuff in 16 seconds. So in terms of the investigation, and the then court case, there were massive knock-ons to having that technology. And I think when we talk about distracted driving, I think technology and third-party reporting is absolutely key with this. And I just can't, emphasize enough how valuable that footage was. The most horrific footage in the world of my husband losing his life, but amazingly, because of it, I never had to watch it because we never had to go to trial. And it was brilliant because we could go to the sentencing. I didn't have to watch it. The judge chose to watch it in closed chambers, and he could make his sentencing based on that footage without subjecting us to it, because I could tell you what happens in it frame by frame, but I never had to watch it and I never had to hear it. And I think that's been really key for allowing me to rebuild my life, is that you try and reduce the harm to the victim as much as possible during the process. And, if every family could go through the process in the way that I went through it, it would be a lot easier. While we're on this road to eradicating road death, we can at least try and make the process less damaging at the same time. In terms of punishment, the driver received a custodial sentence of 3 years, which was reduced to 2 years, which was then reduced to 11 months, which unfortunately then meant he was automatically eligible for early release after 6 months, at which point I sort of completely lost the plot, because I thought, no, he's already had so much off his sentence. This is too much. 6 months on, I was still very raw from the whole experience. I was just starting to go back to work, and I just felt like that was too much. But that footage from the dash cam was so powerful that I could then write to the governor of the prison and say, if you intend on releasing this prisoner early, I will release this footage to the press, and I will kick up the biggest storm you've ever seen around it, and I will name your prison, and I will go to town on you, because it's not okay. At least let him serve that full sentence, because it's already too much. And again, that footage came up trumps for me, and they revoked the early release, and he served his full the full 11 months. He was given a 5-year driving ban, which expired last month. And I was mentioning to some people earlier that I actually find the expiration of his driving ban much harder to process than him being out of prison. I'm not an advocate of long prison sentences anymore. I probably was in that first year, but I think a driving ban is also very pivotal when we're talking about distracted driving, because if you've got a bigger deterrent, then it's going to have a bigger impact on people. If you are caught with your phone at the wheel and you know you could lose your license there and then, it is going to have a bigger impact on people, because people will say they need to drive and they want to drive, and it's part of their, way of survival, rightly or wrongly. I think that's key. So I think the more we can campaign for longer driving bans, complete driving bans, the further along this road will be as well. I just wanted to move on to a little bit about why I tell my story, why I'm a bit bored of telling my story. And I think I've been thinking a lot about this recently in relation to the work that I do. I feel like I'm even desensitized to my own story now. And I think this is part of the problem that we have in life when it comes to hard realities and stories we don't want to hear because they could impact us. We switch off from them. I think when the coverage of the Ukraine invasion first hit our telescreens, everyone was completely impacted by it, because we were able to put ourselves in the shoes of a Western nation, people having to flee their homes because of an invasion, and we all empathized with it hugely. And Ukraine is pretty much still on our screens, but I doubt we're all feeling the same level of shock and empathy that we were early on. And I think it's the same with stories like mine. They're in the press all the time. They're everywhere because it happens every day, 5 times a day. So I think it's about how we tell our stories and why we're telling our stories. Luckily, one of my colleagues recently recorded a TED talk about storytelling, so I've been able to rip off some of what she said for this next bit. But she recorded a TED story, and it's titled "Storytelling is Our Real Life Superpower." She says, when a story moves a person, it has power. And they have the power then to move us from a position of paralysis and fear to one of courageous hope and action. So I think sometimes when you see victims like me talking, there's this tendency to be like, oh God, it's so awful, I feel so sorry for you, I'm so sad. But actually, the jobs that you all do, you could take a story like mine, you could take me, I want to talk about it, and you can use it within your work to create action, because the academics, the statistics, the policing, on its own, it won't get there. But if you combine it with the victims, the stories, you have something different, because you enable people to connect with it. Because I am your worst case scenario. I'm like your worst fear. You don't want it to happen to your husband or wife. You don't want it to happen to your kids. You can put yourself in my shoes and you don't like it. But if you don't like it, you can turn that into action. And I think that's why it's really important to see victims as like a tool to help, rather than someone you need to support and feel sorry for, because actually we're not made of china. If you can live through a road death and turning off a life support machine and seeing that person's body taken for an autopsy and sending their body off to be cremated and then going to pick your 2-year-old up from nursery, you're not going to be made of china anymore. You're made of much tougher stuff. And, that's where Road Peace has been a real lifeline for me, because I went to it as a very vulnerable person who was fresh, it was probably a week or 2 after Eddie had died, and I went to the first support group. And what I found there was not other people. Yeah, actually, there were people sitting around crying, but crying isn't a sign of weakness. Crying is a sign of, Jesus Christ, I really loved that person and now they're dead. But then what you also found was strength. Like, there are people in Road Peace and other organisations that this has happened to them, and they've gone on to do amazing stuff, and they don't stop. Because I think the worst thing you can do is to look at someone like Eddie and go, oh my God, I'm so sorry, it's so sad that happened, and then move on. you need to look at it and go, oh my God, that's so horrific that happened. We need to use that to stop that happening again. And yeah, so I think that's I think I've pretty much said everything I wanted to say, but basically, identify with the victims. Don't treat us as you and us, you and me, whatever. We're all one thing. We're all working for the same thing. And as someone mentioned earlier, it's like the one crime where you could be the victim or the perpetrator in one day. So I think use victims as a strength to move forward with all of this, because we do have the power to change things. And, you know, like just that one piece of footage from Eddie's death has caused much less pain, much less anguish, and also helped other families going forward, because I've been able to talk about how powerful that is, having that footage, and it's made other people get dash cams and, you know, and whatnot, and to talk about things like driving bans and stuff. So it's just that way of engaging with the story and like keeping the good fight going, basically. The end.